Today's video we're going to be showing you how to rig up the gear selector cables for the DD2. Welcome back to the Power Republic YouTube channel. Today's video we're going to be showing you how to install the gear selecting cables for the DD2. Now it's a pretty straightforward process. They just run up to the wheel. It's got a little paddle shifter there, first and second. The dog gear slides across between the two gears in the gearbox. If you haven't seen it, it is a little bit complex to explain on the camera, but one day when I've got a DD2 open, I'll put some pics up on the Instagram for you. So follow along at Power Republic. Also, if you haven't been over to the Power Republic website, we've got a great tutorial series. It's called Racing Rituals. It's brand new. And we run through in depth, braking like a boss, steer it to victory, how to sit to win, and all the maintenance videos in depth in the factory at the track. So if you haven't checked that out, head on over. And now on to the video. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is remove the steering boss and the steering boss support for the steering column so we can install the new DD2 parts. So now that we've got all that removed, we can install the steering column bush for the DD2 shift cables to run through. So it does come with a little grub screw. It's a 3mm, and also you can only put it on one way. So it's just got the end of the cables can go in here. So put that end on first. So the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to nip up this grub screw into place for now, just so it holds it. And we can put all this Tony Kart parts back together. So the first thing we're going to do is install the bolt into the steering boss, and then we can install this little guy. So you can see here we've got a little bit of a cutout. That's to miss these two bolts here on the steering boss. So we're going to put that on there like that. Simply install the nut and the washer. So now we're going to install the paddles. So for now we're just going to mount them roughly. Just nip these little screws up. So obviously you can change the orientation of these little guys to suit yourself. So now we're ready to install the cables and install the shift cut. Grab the cables out of the packet. First thing we're going to do is install the two sheath ends. One goes here, like so, and the other one goes in here. Next up we're going to install our shifting cables. So we go through here, then we're going to come through this little guy. Now you might get pushed out of the way, so you just have to hold your finger there, pull it through. And we're good. Now we're going to install the second gear cable. Next up, we're going to install the outer sheath for the clutch cables. So just remember, when you're cutting the outer sheath of the clutch cable, that the first gear is the longest, and you should start with that one first. Feed the outer sheath underneath the wiring harness, down past the fuel tank. Feed the excess of the outer sheath down through where it's going to run its final position. And we're going to mark it over here just by holding it and cut it with a pair of side cutters. Just like so. Now if the sheath's a bit collapsed here, you can just get a little pick and just open that back up. Now simply feed the cable into the outer sheath. It's a little tight there from where we've cut it with the side cutters, but once it starts moving we're all good. If it gets a bit stiff, you can get yourself some pliers and lightly grip the cable and push it through the sheath. Now you don't want to kink the cable. That's it. Now it's through the other side, and we can just run that down into its final position. Like so. Feed the cable down through the brake side of the steering shaft bush. You're good to go. Now just run the second gear cable out of sheath underneath the wiring harness and up into this bush here on the steering column, and just run the second gear outer sheath around with the first gear outer sheath that you've already put in earlier. Roughly mark it with your fingers, come over with your side cutters. Once again, just open that back up again with your little pick, get it back into round. Now just feed the cable through the outer, same as you did before. And now you can zip tie the cables to the chassis and also to themselves. So now that we've got all the cables run, it's time to connect the cables at the paddle shifter. Make sure first gear is selected by pulling this plate all the way out. Spinning the axle, make sure you're in gear and not in neutral. Make sure the paddle shifter is in first position, and what we're going to do is we're going to hold the cable up to make sure the shifter is all the way up, hold the cable in its little house, and we're going to put a little mark here with a textile so that we can bend the cable back down in a U shape and put it back through the second groove and then attach the screw. So to bend the cable, all we're going to do is pull it out. We've got our texture mark where we want the bend. Grab our pliers, bend it once. If you need to, get a second pair of pliers, hold it there and bend it again. Sometimes this job works better with two sets of pointy nose pliers so that you can get them in there nice and tight, and then you can just close up the cable by squeezing it. Now we should be able to get our M6 cap screw through here and still get a little bit of leverage on our cable if we've got to pull a bit more through. So with first gear selected, we're just going to put our cable into the little cable slots. It's a bit hard to see on the camera. And then we're going to insert the M6 cap screw. Just doing it by feel here. So if you need a little bit of extra leverage, you can grab another little T-bar, just stick it in the eyelet of the cable. Just hold a little bit of pressure on it while you do up the M6 cap screw. And good to go. Now for the second gear cable, hold the paddle shifter down as if first is still selected. Pull the cable up through its little slot, mark the cable with a bit of texture, hold the cable with your pointy nose pliers, bend the cable around until you've got enough so you can squash it a little bit with your pliers. Just like so. So now we can install the M6 cap screw into the paddle shifter. And you just want to hold the cable up in its space. You can feel it there just with a little bit of light pressure. And then what we're going to do is the same thing. Just put the Allen key there to hold the little bit of pressure on the cable and do this one up. So now we can select first gear and second. And now we can select first and second. The last thing we've got to do is install the shift cut. Now, the great thing about the DD2 is that you're fanging down the straight, you're in first gear, and you want to slam it into second. You don't have to back off the accelerator. You hold it down 100%. Just slam on that lever, and the shift cut will kill the engine and make the gear slam across into second. So the harness comes from Rotax, just with this little bit of blue tape on it. Just peel that back. And we're going to attach it to here. We're going to use this screw, and also too, we're going to use this as our insulator. It's going to hold a bit of tension on the bolt. And this here is all plastic. So this is going to earth the shift cut, and then as soon as it goes against the spring and hits onto this bolt, that's what's going to cut the engine. I run the harness cable down underneath the exhaust, and I'll zip tie that back to the shift cables when I'm finished. And for now, we're going to install this through here. Then they give you a little bit of fuel line that goes on next. That's going to be our tensioner, so to speak. And what we're going to do is we're just going to hold that piece of fuel line and screw that guy through there. Now I'm going to use a pair of pliers because it's pretty slippery here today. So I'm going to hold the piece of fuel line there with the pliers and turn this screw, the little ratchet. So now that I've got that all the way down there, we're ready to install it through this little piece of plastic. So now we can just screw this guy in here with our TX30 Torx bit. Now you can see there's a little air gap here. Get yourself a feeler gauge, about 1mm, and you just want to make sure you've got a little air gap there, because you don't want to have this thing bouncing around while you're driving, otherwise it'll cut the engine out. Okay, it's only under shifting. So when you're in first gear, when you go to pull second, that's neutral. Oh, you can sort of see how it just touches the bolt. The self-tapping screw touches the head of the bolt on the engine, and that's what creates the earth, and it cuts the ignition. And now we're just going to zip tie this back to the clutch cables, like so. We don't want to melt it on the exhaust pipe. That's what we're trying to do, is keep the harness away from the exhaust. So you can see how to do the gear cables for the DD2. It's not super complex, it's a little bit time consuming. Just make sure you do the first, as in the first gear cable outer sheath first when you're rigging them up. Put the selector in first and you should be all good. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up. Also too, you can subscribe if you haven't already and turn on those pesky notifications. Check us out on Instagram and Facebook at Power Republic, or go to our amazing website www.powerrepublic.com.au. Grab yourself a new t-shirt or a brand new DD2 race engine. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.